own personal
Well,
narrative.
you think it's very practical, Dad. It's like, well, let's say you want to fix up your house, which is actually quite a lot like fixing yourself up, which is a very common dream metaphor.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing you want to do is go look around and see what needs to be fixed. You know, and the interesting thing about that, and this is akin to what comedians do, is that as soon as you're willing to admit, comedians look at a problem and then rise above it right away and make a joke about it. But as soon as you're willing to admit that you have a problem, then you've immediately contacted the part of yourself that's at least strong enough to admit that you have a problem. And so as soon the act of admitting the problem is actually the first step to solving it.
Yes.
You might say, well, and it's an optimistic step, because you might say, oh my God, I can't admit that I have a problem, because what if I can't solve it? Well, exactly. So then maybe you won't admit to it. If you do admit to it, you're simultaneously admitting to the possibility that you could solve it.
Yes.
And then it can actually become something that's optimistic. You can say, well, my life is horrible. It's like, okay, but I'm doing 50 things wrong. Well, great, I could fix those things, and then maybe it wouldn't be so horrible.
The admission itself demonstrates progression and possibility for further progression.
Exactly.
I think it relates
That's
to
why humility is always stressed in great religious traditions. Humility is precisely that. It's like you have to look at why you're not so good. You have to, and you know, that has to break down your pride to some degree and your arrogance. It's like, well, that's great, because if you break down your pride and your arrogance, then you're primed to learn and you can solve your problems. So there's nothing in that. It's a bit crushing to begin with, because you might think, oh my God, there's really a lot of things wrong with me.
Yes.
But at least then you're on the road to fixing them.
My personal journey of recovery has been like a kind of death. When I was 27, it was like the death of the drug addict self. That guy died.
That's funny, because I told Tammy when we were coming here today that when you were 27, you made the decision to live.
Yes.
I knew it was 27 because that's when people, I'm going to
Die.
say like you, but you know, celebrities who are sort of on fire, they die all the time at 27 because they don't make that decision. They don't decide that they're going to take that final step into maturation. They want to hold on to that Peter Pan thing, that possibility.
Puritanists.
You bet. Exactly that. They want to hold on to that. And you can't hold on to that and live.
Yes, and then there's a further death I'm noticing now in my early 40s, that now at the midway point, at the midway, in a sort of Dante-esque way, and now I'm moving towards the grave, and now I'm like, there's a different kind of alertness emerging. And back to this step 4 and 5 moment, this process of inventorying. After you've made an inventory and you've honestly and openly put down everything, incidents of child abuse, things that you've said to other people, things that your shame, once you've been willing to inscribe your shame, then you tell another person, a person that you trust. In the original literature, it says, it could be a cleric, a doctor, or whatever. Typically in 12-step structures, it's like a mentor figure. But that's the role of confession, which is obviously a huge part of psychoanalysis. The point in your book that I think this pertains to is when you talk about the dragon, and like the dragon, you said there was that kid's book that you read where it talks about the dragon getting bigger and bigger if it's not identified. I think 4 and 5 are somewhat like that.
And part of the point of that kid's book is that as soon as you turn around and look at something, it tends to shrink. And that's partly because imagine that you have a memory that you won't confront. Well, there's something in that memory that's terrifying. And that means it's sort of associated with everything else that's terrifying. And so it's horrible. But then when you turn around and look at it, you think, yeah, it's horrible, but it's horrible in this precise and defined way. And that takes it away from all the other potential horrors of it. It starts to shrink it right away. It also makes you into the thing that can turn around and look at the horror, which is a real positive transformational act on your part. So
that's true, that somehow in being prescriptive and being specific, the problem becomes manageable, because otherwise it's limitless. It's potential. It becomes apocalyptic in the end. What's the worst thing that's happened is I could be destroyed, and everyone I love could be destroyed, and Earth itself could be destroyed. And until you say, well, actually, no, what this is you feel inadequate because you weren't role modeled correctly.
Right.
There's, right, well, I can maybe take care of that.
Right, that's still bad, but it's not everything. And then you phrased that exactly right, is that without that attentive delimiting, it becomes apocalyptic. That's a very, very old idea. So one of the things that happens in the Mesopotamian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, is that the gods are created They're the offspring of chaos. That's a good way of thinking about it. And they become very careless, and they destroy their category system. They destroy their father, essentially, and chaos comes flooding back. And that's what happens to people who aren't looking at things and delimiting them properly. They become apocalyptic and do them in. So,
but sometimes in mythology there is the positive confronting of the god, e.g. Prometheus. So sometimes we need to steal the fire. Sometimes we need to challenge these orthodoxies, don't we?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, part of the death that you're describing is actually the confrontation with a form of tyrant. Like, your previously addicted self was the tyrant over your emergent self.
Yes.
And so it's an internal tyrant, and you said it was predicated on a false value system. That's a false set of gods, essentially. And so you had to confront that. That is a kind of death.
I also think that the addiction or addictive tendencies, and I don't mean as severe as chemical dependency, all forms of addiction are a kind of self-constructed formaldehyde to preserve you in the state of trauma. But trauma is acknowledged. No means to navigate trauma are present because of the isolation, because you have no mentor, you have no doctrine, you have no community. So addiction steps in. This is how I will preserve. This is how I will not die. I will find this notice that it's a habit, a repeated pattern to sustain you, a holding pattern so that you don't die, because there is no way out. There's no guide. There's no path. You're just in the forest and there isn't a way out. So I feel that addiction, for personal experience, and I hope and suspect more broadly, is a means for sort of stasis, for preservation after trauma. The rupture occurs, is not addressed, and a means for survival emerges in the form of addiction. Addiction is not your nemesis; it is your friend, at least while you're, whilst you're in it.
Well, there's certainly a literature on addiction that indicates that many people use addictive substances as a form of self-medication, and they tend to find the drug that best medicates them, let's say. And for different people, that's different drugs.
Yes,
so
or
some
even
people,
gambling.
it's alcohol. Yeah.
I think now, see, one of the other things that I'm proposing in my book, is to use rather grandiose terminology, is that the template for a recovery from obvious forms of addiction could be applicable to less evident forms of addiction, i.e., just patterns and habits, because. Yeah.
Well, so far the things you've laid out would be in keeping with that idea.
Would they?
Well, you admit to the problem.
Yeah.
I really also, I think the idea of laying out your resentments is unbelievably useful, because that's also a way of dealing with the malevolence within you that might interfere with your own recovery.
Yes.
Like, if you're angry at yourself, if you're angry at your parents, if you're angry at the world, the probability that you're going to be in the mental state that's going to allow you to chart a positive course for yourself is very, very low.
How can you have a clear and authentic relationship with your wife if you've not correctly understood what you feel about your own mother? If you feel like that you are enmeshed or trapped in some way, how am I supposed to have if I've not understood that, if I've not gained a new perspective, if I've not transcended it by sharing with another person?
You see that in the Sleeping Beauty story, in the Disney story, when the prince is encapsulated in the castle, in the dungeon at the end, and before he goes and rescues Sleeping Beauty, he has to confront his terrible mother. She turns into the dragon of chaos itself. He has to use honesty and truth to confront her, and until he does that, he can't free the maiden from her sleep.
Yes.
So that's called the freeing of the anima from the negative mother archetype in Jungian psychology. It's precisely that, and that negative feminine will be overlaid on your partner unless you're able to clarify it and clarify your relationship with it. And that could be something like overprotection, or it could, in your past, or it could be neglect, for that matter, or it could be the rejection at the hands of many, many women before you encountered this woman.
Yes.
And you're going to bring that bitterness forward as a kind of projection.
If we are unwilling to undertake this kind of excavation, then we are doomed to continually have relationships that are cutaneous. Just the superficial coordinates will govern our experience of relationship.
Yes. That's the repetition compulsion from a Freudian perspective. That isn't how Freud explained it. That's how a Jungian would explain it. But the simple explanation of it is, well, if you bring the same set of unexamined presuppositions to every situation, the same fate will play out. You might say, well, all those women are the same. It's like, well, actually, no. But the part of them that you're able to make contact with acts the same every time. That's a very different thing.
Brilliant. And this is where 6 and 7, the next steps chronologically occur. Like that 6, having done this inventory, you recognise what patterns have been at play in your life, which particular, in the lexicon of the recovery, defects of character have governed you. Often pride, wanting to control other people's perspective, self-pity, self-centeredness, intolerance, impatience, greed, jealousy, envy, lust, sloth.
Right. That's where you identify the 7 deadly sins and how they play out in your life, essentially.
Yes. And so, and you become, in the step 6 is about becoming willing to live differently. Like saying, are you actually willing to let go of lust?
Right.
Are you, or do you like lust when it comes to it? Do you like being impatient? Does it serve you in some way to be slothful? You know,
And it's highly probable that it does.
yes.
You know, it's easy, it's gratifying, it's powerful, it's pleasurable, especially in the short term. Like there are reasons that people are tempted by the 7 deadly sins. I mean,
yes,
they're
they are
tempting.
kind of glorious.
Oh,
they're dark
absolutely.
glory and beauty.
That's right. They have
allure.
that's exactly right. There's a dark romanticism, and you really see that in the deaths of celebrities around 27. Is they fall in love with the allure of that kind of that romantic death, and it does them in.
Sort of the anti-libido, the dark libido, the death force.
Mm-hmm.
So once you have diagnosed which particular defects of character have been most prominent in your path and become willing to let go of them, this, like it's step 7, is making a concerted and real effort to live without them. And this is where it kind of becomes...
That's a sacrifice there, eh? That's what are you willing to sacrifice in order to move forward? You have to give up something that you love. And you may have to give up the thing you love the best.
Yes.
That's the fundamental sacrificial motif.
Sacrifice is an unattractive idea in our society that's based on consuming and indulgence. And this is not something that I would lay... So this is, again, perhaps where you and I somewhat differ, is that I would not... whilst this will not change without the individual's engagement, a kind of step 1, an acknowledgement that it needs to be changed, this is where I say there is a social responsibility that, for whatever reason, our society has become a manifestation of these darker impulses. These are the prevalent forces, at least in the kind of society I live in. I don't know what it's like to live in China or Libya. I'm just saying, like in London, like what you're
Too much
hit with.
emphasis on immediate gratification.
Too much emphasis on, because immediate gratification is a tool of consumerism. This would be my argument. So, like, but at this point in the program, it's where the spirituality becomes, I find personally, undeniable. That you have to call to something else. You have to, in a sense, lay yourself open. The idea of prayer becomes quite important. Now,
so there's a Jungian idea there. So the Jungian self is the thing that guides the ego through transformations. So imagine the ego, which is what you think you are. Well, the thing about the ego is that the ego can be wrong, and the ego can die and be reborn. So what that indicates is that there's something underneath the ego that can guide that process of transformation. And partly what you're calling on when you call on this higher power is, at least from a psychological perspective, it's a decision to rely on that thing that can guide you through transformations.
Yes, because surely, as we said, in relation to another, we are likely relating to a set of coordinates that we impose on, inverted commas, the female. The same would be true of the self, that we have created an impression, an egoic impression. We have constructed an artificial self, but beneath it there is a higher self or an ulterior self that can
it's often composed of things that you refused to or weren't willing to develop. And so when Jung talks about, for example, the incorporation of the shadow, is that you've constructed an ego and there's things it can do and can't do, that it's allowed to do and it isn't allowed to do. And then there's a shadow domain that would consist of those things that you could do but haven't. And some of that's terrible, but some of it's what you need to break free.
Is there infinite variety in the shadow, or are there sort of templates there? Would you say that, a common component of the shadow is aggression?
Aggression and lust are the two, because they're the two that are most
uncivilized.
Yeah, they're the two that are most difficult to integrate into the ego, because aggression destroys, and of course lust subsumes the individual to sexual desire.
It's lust is identified as a very powerful self. It can subsume. So I suppose that's why a lot of theological doctrines focus on the control of lust. And there is, of course,
it's a disruptive force, because, for example, if you make a medium to long-term relationship with someone and you negotiate that provides you with a stable structure that can operate across your entire life. It's good for you, it's good for them, it's good for your kids, it's good for society. But then if you're really attracted to someone momentarily, You can be driven to act on that, and all the rest of that can burn up. It's not good. And so it's no wonder that it's viewed as a force of tremendous disruption. Now, it's also a force of tremendous life, right? Because you want to be attracted to people. You want to have that vital libido as part of what's driving you forward, but hopefully it's on your side and not working against you. And so, if you're successful and you've put yourself together and you're disciplined, you should still be maximally sexually attractive, but it should be under your control. You're not the puppet of that force anymore. It's integrated into you. And that's a much better way to manage it.
How do you, in your understanding, how is the shadow incorporated? What rituals, what ceremonies, what behaviours successfully incorporate the shadow? Say, using the example of lust, what's a way back in for the sort of for lust that has been disembodied or repressed? What is a safe way for it back in? Is there one?
Well, I think part of it is to admit to your desires within your own relationship. Because you might say, well, I'm tired of my wife. It's like, well, yeah, maybe you're tired of the games that you're intelligent enough to play with your wife, but she's as pluripotential as you are. And so you have to admit to your desires, let's say, and maybe you have to make them consciously manifest within your own relationship. And then, and people can do that. People do that by dressing up or by playing sexually, I would say.
Yeah, play.
Because by play, exactly that. And play is a transformative element. And that should be, and it might be that you're uncomfortable with the idea of your wife as sexual plaything because you think that a woman who's married should be proper and prim and should only behave sexually in a certain way. In which case, well, that becomes sterile and dull and you're more likely to be tempted by something on the outside.
For me, that's a very obvious example of how habitualized thinking is prohibitive even without reaching the extremes of self-destructive addictive tendencies. If I have a habit of regarding my wife as object A, even if that's not objectification as we typically take it, but limiting beliefs about my wife, the tools that break down addictive thought patterns could be used to create new terrains, new liberty, new play. Thank you. So once you've done up to step 7, which is essentially step 7, you're right, it's sort of sacrifice of the old self and handing over to some kind of sublime divine self. The step 8 is you make a list of people that you have harmed and become willing to make amends to them. So you look back at your past and go, God, I shouldn't have stolen that. I shouldn't have done that. I treated that person badly. That was wrong. I lied. So it's moral. It becomes quite a moral process.
And that's a real repentance, right? And atonement. Atonement is at one meant.
Yes.
And if you're carrying transgressions that you regard as transgressions now in your life, then you don't want to carry those forward. You want to step forward in life without that moral burden, because you'll have contempt for yourself otherwise, and you won't take care of yourself.